Hey y'all, it's Mr. Delot, and today we're going to be talking about some stuff that comes out of section 4.9 in your textbook. A few things that we've mentioned a couple of times already, just kind of with the emerging national culture of the United States in the early parts of the 1800s, right? And this is something that we've had a few politicians kind of push for. We've talked about the Transcendentalists a little bit, trying to say we should develop our own national culture, and so that's what we'll get into today. In the first half of the 1800s, and especially after the War of 1812, that's exactly what the United States does. We kind of come into our own culturally. We start making art and architecture and literature, and we get some scientific achievements and everything that combine like America's European heritage for the most part with like a lot more local flavor, like North American perspectives, like some regional like sensibilities and identities from the North, from the South, from the West, and everything. And you see that in a lot of different examples that we'll get into in just a sec. But the first one I want to talk about for just a little bit is John James Audubon, and that's just because he's really important for us here. In Louisiana, I mean, he did a lot of work and research in things like bird flight patterns and species and all, and he did a lot of that work right up the road here in St. Francisville at Oakley Plantation, which is now Audubon State Historic Site that you can go visit and everything. And he was especially interested in like the coloration and everything of all these different bird species, and he writes it all down in the Birds of America, which is just a book of nothing but pictures of all the different birds that you would see in the different regions of the country. And this guy doesn't just catalog all the different birds, he discovers at least a couple of dozen new species, which is why the State Historic Site is named after him, as well as the zoo in New Orleans. Anyway, getting a little bit more into some other art here. I mean, art and painting have been a thing that was, growing in popularity and in really skill for the most part in America after independence. And one of the things you see people paint a lot of is like everyday life. In the 1830s, people riding riverboats, people going to the polls and voting in elections and doing domestic chores and stuff like that, and just trying to showcase what life was like in the United States, on the frontier, in the port cities, in democracy, and all that. And the art movement that kind of really comes to a head first here, that is kind of reflecting romanticism from Europe and a lot of things with like the natural world and landscapes and all this, called the Hudson River School from New York, obviously. Main two guys that are going to be influential from there are Thomas Cole and Frederick Church. These two guys both paint a lot of U.S. landscapes, and they're trying to emphasize like the natural splendor, like the beauty of North America. And it's very patriotic, and it's kind of heroic. And again, that's the romanticist influence, the romantic influence that you see in a lot of these paintings, whether it's of elections and voting or more usually with landscapes. And in terms of kind of glorifying democracy and like the spirit of a democratic population in America, you see that in architecture and art too. Like there's a lot of Greek revival style houses and government buildings and everything, right? If you think of plantation houses in the South with those huge white columns, or any government buildings in Washington, D.C., like the Capitol, the White House, the Supreme Court building, all of that shows that classical revival style, with the big facades and the huge like public entryways where all of the people symbolically are able to go into the building at the same time. And that influence kind of carries on for quite a while in American governmental buildings, at least. Anyway, one of the main things I want to talk about this with this American culture that's grown up is the explosion of American literature that happens after the War of 1812, right? And a lot of this stuff is going to be books that you've heard of from English class, or that you will read in college later on, like American classics, right? And some of that is coming from the Transcendentalists, Walden and so on. But there's other people that are writing a lot more after the War of 1812 that are in a distinctly American style. Partially due to nationalism after the War of 1812, partially due to people pushing to make a distinct national identity, like Ralph Waldo Emerson doing that. And so you see a lot more American themes in the literature. Some of it is patriotism. A lot of it is romanticism, where they're trying to glorify the new American democracy, right? And there's a few key figures here in literature that y'all are going to need to know that might pop up on the AP test. The first one, and most prominent, and one of my two favorites on this list, is going to be James Fenimore Cooper, who was huge in the 1800s. He had a lot of his books turned into movies and everything. He's still fairly popular now. But his main kind of series is called the Leatherstocking Tales, which is a whole series of books that he writes between 1824 and 1841. That includes titles like Last of the Mohicans, which is a great movie with Daniel Day-Lewis. That if you haven't seen that movie, it's really really good. But everything Daniel Day-Lewis does is really good. Not a sponsor, although honestly, you know, Dan, if you're listening, maybe we can work out a deal here. But there's a lot of other books in that same series, like the Pathfinder and the Deerslayer, where the central character, a guy named Natty Bumppo, is kind of like presented as nature's nobleman, right? A glorified frontiersman who goes on all these adventures, and he kind of fights to defend his family and defend the frontier and everything. And those Leatherstocking Tales are going to be kind of like the quintessential like American novel for those couple of decades in the lead up to the Civil War and everything. Next guy, another one that a lot of y'all have probably heard of, is Washington Irving. He writes a bunch of other American classics like Rip Van Winkle, which is a story about a guy who falls asleep before the Revolutionary War for years. I think it's 20 years, and he falls asleep and he wakes up and the American Revolution's already all happened and all. And so the book talks about all of these great changes that have happened in American society because of the revolution. So again, it's glorifying democracy and establishing America as its own culture, right? Another Washington Irving book is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane, The Headless Horseman, Katrina von Tassel, all that, like the Disney movie adaptation. But Irving is writing, like I say, a lot of fiction that are in distinctly American settings that talk about the revolution, that talk about like essentially small town American life. And he's making new themes in his books that are all American. And going along with the transcendentalists that we were talking about earlier, we've got Nathaniel Hawthorne, which I know a lot of y'all read in English. Probably the most important thing that he writes is the Scarlet Letter, which is the one with the adulteress that has to sew the big A on her clothes to show that she's cheating on her husband. And really, the book is a commentary on like conformity and like social norms and all in early America, and it questions like the intolerance of anybody that doesn't conform with like old religious expectations and things like that in society. And just in general, like that kind of criticism of society goes along with the transcendentalists that we talked about before, like kind of questioning like the way that the status quo is in America and how do we fix problems in society? How do we address issues with religion, right? And then the last guy that we'll talk about for literature real quick is Herman Melville, who writes Moby Dick, the whale killing story, that talks about this epic quest that's almost fanatical to hunt down this white whale, which kind of reflects an American perspective just from the fact that it's about the whaling industry, which was huge on the East Coast at the time. But there's a lot of like biblical references and things in Moby Dick as well that kind of reflect the theological conflict of like the time after the Second Great Awakening and some of the cultural conflicts too. Because like Captain Ahab is hell bent on chasing down this whale. And it's supposed to be like an allegory for like pride and vengefulness and everything. But you also get in Moby Dick a lot of other religious perspectives, things that aren't just strictly like traditional Christianity. You've got new versions of Christianity that are kind of reflected in it. You've also got a little bit of non-Christian values. And so it's reflecting also a little bit more like toleration in general. And I don't know, maybe a little bit of transcendentalist influence there as well, because like Ahab is not exactly a sympathetic character, right? He's messing with nature, and the transcendentalists probably wouldn't like that. But anyway, I could talk about Moby Dick for probably 20 minutes because it's probably my favorite book on the list that we've just talked about here today. But anyway, that's where we'll stop today. Nice and quick one. I will see y'all next time.